The Real History of Ford Motor Company. Chapter 1. The Farm Boy's Dream, 1863 to 1903. Our story begins on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan, on July 30th, 1863, in the midst of the American Civil War. On that summer day, Mary and William Ford welcomed their first son into the world. They named him Henry. The Fords were Irish immigrants who had fled poverty and the Great Famine in Ireland, settling in Michigan where land was available and opportunity seemed possible. William Ford had carved out a modest but productive farm from the Michigan wilderness, building a life from hard work and determination. He dreamed that his son would continue this tradition, working the land and building on what he had started. But from his earliest years, Henry Ford showed little interest in farming. While his father spoke enthusiastically of crop rotations, soil conditions, and livestock breeding, young Henry's attention was invariably drawn to anything mechanical. He was fascinated by watches, tools, machines, and any device that moved or could be taken apart and studied. At age 12, he received a pocket watch as a gift, and within hours he had completely disassembled it to understand its intricate workings. To his mother's relief and his father's amazement, he managed to put it back together perfectly, and it still kept accurate time. Soon, neighbors from miles around were bringing him their broken watches, clocks, and mechanical devices, and the young boy became known throughout the area as someone who could fix almost anything mechanical. The defining moment of Henry Ford's childhood came in 1876, when he was just 13 years old. While riding with his father in their horse-drawn wagon on a dirt road near the family farm, they encountered something Henry had never seen before: a self-propelled steam engine. It was a Westinghouse agricultural engine designed to power threshing equipment, but it was moving under its own power along the road, traveling from one farm to another. The machine was massive, belching steam and smoke, its wheels turning without any horses pulling it. Young Henry was absolutely transfixed by this mechanical marvel. He immediately jumped down from the wagon and spent the next hour examining every detail of the steam engine, peppering its operator with endless questions. How did it work? How was it controlled? How much coal did it consume? How fast could it go? What made it move? The operator, amused by the boy's intense curiosity and surprising technical knowledge, patiently explained the basics of steam power, boilers, pistons, and mechanical linkages. That encounter changed Henry Ford's life forever. From that moment forward, he had a clear vision. If steam power could move such a heavy agricultural engine, surely it could be harnessed to create a lightweight vehicle specifically designed to transport people. He became obsessed with the idea of a self-propelled vehicle, a horseless carriage that would free people from their dependence on animals for transportation. This obsession would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. But before Henry could pursue his mechanical dreams, tragedy struck the Ford family. In 1876, when Henry was just 13, his mother Mary died during childbirth. Mary had been Henry's greatest champion, the one person who truly understood and encouraged his mechanical interests, even when his father disapproved and thought they were foolish distractions from farm work. Her death left young Henry devastated and fundamentally changed his relationship with the farm and his father. The house felt empty and cold without her gentle presence and encouragement. His father's expectations about continuing the farming tradition now felt like heavy chains holding him back from his true calling and destiny. In 1879, at age 16, Henry made a decision that would define his future. He left the family farm, and walked the 9 miles to Detroit, carrying little more than a change of clothes and his determination to learn about machines and engines. In Detroit, he found work as an apprentice machinist at the James F. Flower & Brothers machine shop. The pay was meager, just $2.50 a week, barely enough to afford a small room in a boarding house and simple meals. To supplement his tiny income, he repaired watches and clocks at night, working by candlelight and oil lamp after his long days at the machine shop. He rarely slept more than 4 or 5 hours a night, but he didn't mind. He was learning, growing, developing skills, and moving closer to his dream with every passing day. Over the next several years, Ford moved between various machine shops, factories, and engineering firms in Detroit and surrounding areas, constantly learning and developing his technical skills and knowledge. He worked for the Detroit Dry Dock Company, where he learned about large steam engines and heavy industrial machinery. He worked as a traveling engineer for the Westinghouse Company, servicing and repairing steam engines on farms across southern Michigan. Each job added to his comprehensive knowledge of mechanical engineering and brought him incrementally closer to his ultimate goal of building a self-propelled vehicle for personal transportation. In 1888, at age 25, Henry married Clara Jane Bryant, a farmer's daughter from a nearby community whom he had met at a New Year's Eve dance several years earlier. Clara would become far more than just Henry's wife. She would become his lifelong partner, his strongest supporter, his confidant, and sometimes the voice of calm reason when Henry's obsessive pursuit of his dreams threatened to consume everything else in their lives. When Henry explained his seemingly impossible dream of building a horseless carriage that would revolutionize e-transportation, Clara didn't laugh or tell him he was wasting his time on foolish fantasies. Instead, she believed in him absolutely and supported his experiments and work, even when they consumed their limited financial resources and filled their small home with the constant smell of oil, gasoline, and hot metal. That same year, Henry reluctantly returned to Dearborn to work land that his father gave him, hoping this would finally settle his son into farming. William Ford offered Henry 40 acres of timberland if he would give up his mechanical pursuits and become a proper farmer like his father and grandfather before him. Henry accepted the land, but absolutely refused to accept the condition that came with it. He built a small workshop on the property where he spent every spare moment working on engines, studying mechanical designs, and dreaming of horseless carriages, while only half-heartedly attending to the farming duties that held no interest for him. By the early 1890s, Ford had become aware of a revolutionary new development that would change everything: the internal combustion engine. Unlike steam engines, which required heavy boilers, large quantities of water, significant preparation time, and produced limited power relative to their considerable weight, internal combustion engines were compact, relatively lightweight, and remarkably powerful for their size. They ran on gasoline, which was cheap and readily available as a byproduct of kerosene production for lighting lamps. This was the breakthrough technology that could finally make Henry's long-held dream of a practical horseless carriage a tangible reality rather than just an impossible fantasy. In 1891, Ford made a decision that would prove crucial to his future success. He took a job with the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit as an engineer, responsible for maintaining and repairing the steam engines that generated electricity for the city's growing electrical lighting system. The job paid well and had reasonable, predictable hours. But more importantly, it gave him access to a proper machine shop with good tools and equipment. He rented a modest house on Bagley Avenue in Detroit, and behind the house stood a brick shed that would soon become the birthplace of his automotive dreams. There, working late into the night after his regular shifts at Edison Illuminating, often until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, Henry Ford began the painstaking work of building his first automobile. The work was incredibly difficult, frustrating, and slow. Everything had to be fabricated by hand, piece by individual piece. There were no automotive supply companies, no manufacturers of specialized car parts, no mail-order catalogs offering components for automobile builders. Every single bolt, every gear, every bracket, every component had to be either manufactured from scratch in Henry's tiny workshop using basic tools, or cleverly adapted from existing farm machinery, bicycles, or industrial equipment. Ford scavenged parts wherever he could find them, buying used equipment, visiting scrap yards, and constantly improvising solutions to mechanical problems. The wheels came from a horse-drawn buggy. The engine was painstakingly built piece by piece over many months, based on technical drawings he studied in scientific magazines, engineering journals, and his own innovative ideas and modifications. Clara Ford was his constant, unwavering supporter during this long, difficult period, though she must have sometimes wondered if her husband's consuming obsession would ever produce tangible, practical results. Their small house perpetually smelled of machine oil, gasoline fumes, and hot metal. Henry's work clothes were always stained with grease and oil, no matter how much Clara washed them. Their modest savings were steadily consumed purchasing materials, tools, and equipment for the project. But Clara never once complained or suggested that Henry give up his dream. She brought Henry sandwiches and coffee when he worked through dinner time. She believed in his vision and abilities when almost no one else did, providing the emotional support that kept him going through countless failures and frustrations. On a rainy night in June of 1896, after years of exhausting work, hundreds of failed experiments and modifications, and countless late nights of problem-solving, Henry Ford's first automobile was finally ready for its maiden test. He called it the quadricycle because it ran on 4 bicycle wheels. It had a simple 2-cylinder gasoline engine that produced approximately 4 horsepower. It had 2 forward gears but no reverse gear, and it was steered with a tiller mechanism like a boat rather than a steering wheel. It was primitive by any standard, noisy, temperamental, and certainly not pretty. But it represented the culmination of Henry Ford's life's dream up to that point, the physical manifestation of the vision that had driven him since he was 13 years old. There was just one significant problem that Henry hadn't anticipated in his single-minded focus on making the vehicle mechanically functional. The completed quadricycle was wider than the door of the brick shed where he had built it. In his intense concentration on solving the mechanical and engineering challenges, he had completely forgotten to ensure that he could actually get the finished vehicle out of his workshop and onto the street. The solution was simple, if somewhat destructive. Henry picked up an axe and knocked out part of the brick wall, widening the doorway enough to carefully wheel the quadricycle out into the alley behind his house. At around 2 o'clock on that rainy morning, with his friend Jim Bishop walking ahead carrying a lantern to light the way through the dark streets, Henry Ford climbed onto his quadricycle and drove it through the empty streets of Detroit. The engine's distinctive pop-pop-pop sound echoed off the buildings, occasionally waking light-sleeping residents who peered out their windows to see what strange commotion was disturbing the night. The vehicle moved at about 10 miles per hour, roughly the speed of a fast horse trot, but it moved entirely under its own power without any animal to pull it. Henry had actually done it. After years of work, countless setbacks, and moments of deep doubt, he had successfully built a working horseless carriage. After that first successful test drive of approximately 6 miles through Detroit's streets, Ford returned home absolutely exhilarated, but already mentally redesigning and planning improvements to his creation. Over the next several years, Ford built and tested several progressively improved vehicles, each one more sophisticated, reliable, and practical than the last. His work and growing reputation came to the attention of Detroit's business community and wealthy investors who were becoming interested in the emerging automobile industry. In 1899, a group of wealthy Detroit businessmen formed the Detroit Automobile Company with Henry Ford as superintendent and chief engineer. Finally, Ford had significant financial backing and the resources to build automobiles on a larger, more commercial scale, rather than one at a time in his backyard shed. But the partnership was troubled from the very beginning. The investors wanted Ford to begin producing vehicles for sale immediately, to start generating revenue and, hopefully, profits as quickly as possible. Ford, however, was an obsessive perfectionist who wanted to continue refining and improving his designs until they met his exacting standards for reliability and performance. He believed that rushing production of vehicles that weren't fully developed would result in unreliable automobiles that would fail in customers' hands, damaging both his personal reputation and the viability of the entire automobile concept. The few vehicles that the Detroit Automobile Company did manage to produce were expensive to manufacture, mechanically unreliable, and consequently sold very poorly. By 1901, after less than 2 years of operation, the company had completely collapsed, having produced fewer than 20 vehicles and losing most of the investors' substantial capital. The failure was a serious blow to Ford's reputation in Detroit's business community. He was now known among investors and businessmen as a brilliant mechanic and creative engineer, but a poor businessman who couldn't deliver practical commercial results. Many prominent investors and business leaders privately said they would never invest in another Henry Ford venture. But Ford himself refused to be discouraged or to give up on his dreams. If anything, the failure clarified and focused his vision. He didn't just want to build automobiles for wealthy enthusiasts who could afford expensive, finicky machines. He wanted to build a simple, reliable, affordable automobile that ordinary working people could afford and depend on. A vehicle that would truly democratize personal transportation and give average families the freedom and mobility that only wealthy people currently enjoyed. To rebuild his damaged reputation and prove the practical capabilities of his automotive designs, Ford made a strategic decision. He would turn to automobile racing, which was rapidly becoming popular in America as both a sport and public spectacle. In 1901, working with limited resources, Ford built a racing car that he called the Sweepstakes. It was a stripped-down, lightweight vehicle with a large, powerful engine and minimal body. He used this car to challenge Alexander Winton, the most famous and successful racing driver of the era and manufacturer of expensive, highly regarded automobiles. On October 10, 1901, on a rough dirt track, hastily laid out on the Grosse Pointe Fairgrounds near Detroit, before a crowd of thousands of spectators, Henry Ford driving his sweepstakes defeated Winton's supposedly superior racing car in a dramatic race. The victory made front-page headlines in Detroit newspapers and made Ford instantly famous throughout the city and region. More importantly, from a business perspective, it attracted the attention of new investors who reasoned that if Ford could build race cars that defeated the best vehicles in America, he could surely build successful, reliable road cars for everyday use. In November 1902, the Henry Ford Company was formed with fresh financial backing from a new group of prominent Detroit businessmen who believed in Ford's potential. But once again, Ford quickly clashed with his investors over fundamental issues of control and business direction. The investors, burned by the failure of the Detroit Automobile Company and wary of Ford's perfectionism, brought in Henry Leland, an established, respected engineer and manufacturer, to supervise and provide oversight of Ford's work. Ford absolutely refused to accept supervision or direction from anyone, regardless of their credentials or experience. He believed passionately in his vision and abilities, and he was unwilling to compromise. In March 1903, after just a few months of escalating conflict, Ford left the company, taking with him only his name, his reputation, and his determination. The Henry Ford Company would continue without him, and would eventually become the highly successful Cadillac Motor Company. But that success would belong to others. At age 40, Henry Ford had now failed twice to establish a successful, lasting automobile company. He had developed a reputation throughout Detroit's business community for being difficult, stubborn, impractical, impossible to work with, and unable to cooperate with reasonable investors who were simply trying to protect their financial interests. Many prominent businessmen and potential investors considered him essentially unemployable and uninvestable. But these failures had taught Ford crucial, invaluable lessons about what he needed to succeed. He now knew exactly what kind of company he wanted to build, exactly what kind of automobile he wanted to create, and most importantly, exactly what kind of business partners and investors he needed. People who would give him the operational control and adequate time necessary to fully realize his vision without constant interference or pressure for immediate profits. In June 1903, Henry Ford and a small, carefully selected group of investors, including coal dealer Alexander Malcolmson, who became his primary financial partner, filed incorporation papers for the Ford Motor Company. The company was modestly capitalized at just $28,000, a relatively small sum even by the standards of that era. Ford owned 25.5% of the stock, making him the largest single shareholder, and he was given the titles of vice president and chief engineer, positions that gave him essentially complete operational control of the company's day-to-day activities and design decisions. The Ford Motor Company began operations in a small rented factory on Mack Avenue in Detroit with just a dozen workers and minimal equipment. They didn't manufacture complete automobiles from raw materials. Instead, they assembled vehicles by hand from major components and parts purchased from specialized outside suppliers. The Dodge brothers, John and Horace, who operated a machine shop, supplied engines and other critical mechanical components under contract. Various other suppliers provided bodies, wheels, axles, and other parts. Ford's role was to design the vehicles, manage quality, oversee assembly operations, and gradually build a reputation for reliability and value. The first automobile they produced was designated the Model A Ford to distinguish it from the many other vehicles called Model A, being produced by various manufacturers in that era. It was a simple, practical, well-built automobile with a two-cylinder engine. It was relatively light in weight, easy to operate once you learned the basics, and sold for $850, a price that put it within reach of prosperous middle-class buyers, such as doctors, lawyers, successful merchants, and well-paid, skilled craftsmen. The Model A wasn't the cheapest car available on the market, but it offered genuinely excellent value for its price. It was reliable, reasonably easy to maintain, well-constructed, and got the job done. The very first Model A was sold to Dr. Ernest Pfennig, a Chicago dentist, on July 23, 1903. Dr. Pfennig was so thoroughly satisfied with his Ford automobile that he became an enthusiastic, vocal promoter of the brand, actively encouraging his friends, family, patients, and professional colleagues to seriously consider buying Fords. This kind of positive word-of-mouth endorsement, multiplied across hundreds of satisfied early customers throughout the Midwest, helped firmly establish Ford Motor Company's growing reputation for building genuinely dependable, practical automobiles that delivered on their promises. The Model A exceeded even Ford's hopeful expectations. By the end of the first full year of production, Ford Motor Company had sold over 650 vehicles, an impressive number for a brand-new company. More importantly, for long-term viability, the company was solidly profitable, earning modest but real returns for its patient investors. By the end of the second year, the company had sold over 1,000 Model A vehicles and was firmly established in the competitive automobile market. Henry Ford, at age 41, had finally achieved what had eluded him through years of failure and frustration. He had created a successful, sustainable, profitable automobile company that was entirely under his control. But this hard-won success was just the beginning. The revolutionary vision that would truly transform American transportation and fundamentally reshape American society was still taking concrete form in Henry Ford's restless, ambitious mind. The Model T, the moving assembly line, and the transformation of America into an automotive society still lay ahead. Chapter 2. The Model T Revolution, 1908 to 1920. The years from 1903 to 1908 saw the Ford Motor Company grow steadily and successfully, moving through a deliberate succession of models as Ford and his engineers continuously learned and refined their understanding of automobile design and manufacturing. After the initial Model A came the Model B, a more luxurious and powerful vehicle specifically aimed at wealthy buyers who wanted something more prestigious. Then came the Model C, an improved version of the Model A, then the Model F, the Model K, the Model N, the Model R, and the Model S. Ford was constantly experimenting with different designs, features, and price points, systematically learning what customers truly wanted, what they would pay for, and which technical features and design elements worked best in real-world conditions. The Model K, introduced in 1906, proved particularly instructive, though not in the way Ford's business partners had hoped. It was a large, heavy, expensive, luxury automobile selling for $2,800, specifically designed and positioned to compete with high-end vehicles from established luxury manufacturers. Ford's business partners believed firmly that luxury vehicles offered the best profit margins, and that the company should focus its resources and energy on serving this lucrative, profitable market segment. But the Model K sold poorly, failing to meet even modest sales projections. More importantly, for Ford's strategic thinking, its commercial failure convinced Henry Ford that his partners were fundamentally, completely wrong about the company's proper direction and future. The future, Ford became absolutely certain, wasn't in expensive cars manufactured for wealthy customers. The future was in simple, reliable, affordable cars specifically designed for ordinary working people and middle-class families. This fundamental philosophical divide created increasing tension between Ford and some of his business partners, particularly Alexander Malcolmson, his primary financial backer. The brewing conflict finally came to a head in 1906, when Ford, working with other investors and board members, engineered Malcolmson's removal from the company through a complex, carefully planned series of stock transactions, proxy fights, and corporate maneuvers. With Malcolmson gone and his shares acquired, Ford gained the control he had long craved and needed. He was now by far the largest shareholder and president of the company, with essentially absolute authority over strategy and operations. He could finally pursue his revolutionary vision without constant interference, opposition, or the need for endless compromises. And that vision was taking increasingly concrete, detailed form in Ford's mind and in his discussions with his closest engineering collaborators. Ford wanted to create what he called the universal car, an automobile so fundamentally simple in design, so utterly reliable in operation, and so affordable in price that it would democratize personal transportation and fundamentally change how millions of Americans lived their daily lives. He envisioned a vehicle that would serve everyone: farmers and city dwellers, businessmen and factory workers, people in every corner and region of America. It would have to be tough and durable enough to handle the rough, often terrible country roads that connected rural America. It would have to be simple enough in design and construction that owners could perform basic maintenance and repairs themselves with common tools, since professional mechanics were scarce outside major cities. And it would have to be affordable enough that a factory worker earning decent industrial wages could realistically save up and purchase one. In 1907, Ford gathered his most trusted and talented engineers and designers in a secret room on the third floor of the Piquette Avenue plant. The room was kept locked at all times, and only a carefully selected group knew what important work was happening inside those walls. Ford told his hand-picked team that they were going to design an entirely new automobile from scratch, one that would make all previous cars, including Ford's own successful current models, completely obsolete and outdated. The design process was intense, comprehensive, and exhaustive. Often running late into the night, Ford was personally, intimately involved in virtually every design decision. From the choice of materials to the position of every control lever, the engine would be a simple but robust four-cylinder design, providing adequate power for the vehicle's purposes while remaining mechanically simple and highly reliable. Ford insisted absolutely on using vanadium steel, a European alloy that was significantly lighter and stronger than conventional steel used by other manufacturers, even though it was more expensive to purchase and more difficult to work with using existing American steelworking techniques. The suspension system would be designed specifically and explicitly to handle the rough, rutted rural roads that connected most of America, with high ground clearance to navigate muddy tracks, deep ruts, and the countless unpaved roads that were the norm rather than the exception. All controls would be simplified as much as possible, so that almost anyone of average intelligence could learn to drive and operate the car with just minimal instruction and practice. Crucially, and most importantly, for Ford's long-term manufacturing strategy, the car would be designed from the very beginning specifically for true mass production, using standardized, completely interchangeable parts, manufactured to precise tolerances. There would be no custom orders, no special variations for individual customers, no optional features. Beyond a few carefully selected basic accessories, every single car would be essentially identical to every other car of the same model, allowing the company to perfect and continuously refine its manufacturing processes and drive costs relentlessly downward through massive economies of scale. Some industry observers and competitors thought this complete lack of customization and variety would hurt sales and limit market appeal. But Ford believed passionately that it was the essential key to achieving his goal of creating truly affordable personal transportation for the masses. By spring of 1908, after months of intensive design work, testing, and refinement, the new car was ready for public introduction. Ford called it the Model T, simply continuing his established alphabetical naming system. On October 1st, 1908, the Model T Ford was officially introduced to the American public with considerable fanfare and publicity. It was priced at $825 for the basic touring car model, somewhat less than the Model N it was replacing, but still more than the cheapest cars available from other manufacturers. Ford believed firmly that the Model T offered far superior value compared to anything else available at its price point or even well above it. The Model T's design was genuinely revolutionary in its elegant simplicity and ruthless focus on practicality. The simple 20-horsepower four-cylinder engine was robust and surprisingly powerful and efficient for its size. The innovative two-speed planetary gear transmission was dramatically simpler and easier to operate than the complex, difficult manual transmissions found in virtually all competitors' cars, making the Model T accessible to drivers with limited experience or mechanical aptitude. The body and passenger compartments sat high on the sturdy chassis, providing over 10 inches of ground clearance, absolutely perfect for the rutted, muddy dirt roads that still connected most of rural America to towns and cities. The vanadium steel used throughout the vehicle's construction was both stronger and lighter than the steel competitors used, making the Model T simultaneously more durable and relatively fuel efficient. But what truly set the Model T apart from every competitor and made it legendary was its remarkable versatility and legendary ruggedness. It could handle virtually any conceivable road condition, from smooth city streets to muddy country lanes to barely visible two-track paths through forests and fields. It was simple enough in design and construction that owners could perform most maintenance and many repairs themselves, using common hand tools available at any hardware store, an absolutely essential feature in an era when professional automobile mechanics were scarce and expensive outside major urban centers. Replacement parts were deliberately designed to be standardized, interchangeable, and readily available through Ford's rapidly growing network of authorized dealers across the country. And unlike many automobiles of that era, which were notoriously temperamental machines requiring constant attention, adjustment, and nursing along, the Model T was remarkably reliable, forgiving, and tolerant of rough treatment and occasional neglect. The American public's response to the Model T was immediate, enthusiastic, and completely overwhelming. Within just the first year of production, Ford Motor Company sold more than 10,000 Model T vehicles, far exceeding even the company's most optimistic internal projections and sales forecasts. Demand was so extraordinarily strong and persistent that production simply couldn't keep pace, despite the company's best efforts. Customers routinely waited many months for delivery of their ordered Model T, and yet they continued to order them. Ford dealers reported that farmers would come into town, see a Model T for the first time, and immediately buy one on the spot, paying in cash that they had been carefully saving for years, specifically to purchase an automobile when one finally became available and affordable. This enormous, sustained demand created both a tremendous opportunity and a serious challenge for Ford Motor Company. The opportunity was obvious and compelling. If Ford could somehow produce enough Model T automobiles to meet this seemingly insatiable demand, the company would become enormously, almost unimaginably, profitable. The challenge was equally clear and pressing. Ford's existing factory on Piquette Avenue simply wasn't large enough or efficient enough to produce vehicles in anything approaching the quantities needed to satisfy demand. The company urgently needed a much larger facility, one designed from the ground up, specifically and exclusively for efficient automobile production on a scale never before attempted in any industry anywhere in the world. In 1910, after intensive planning and remarkably rapid construction, Ford's massive new Highland Park manufacturing plant was completed and ready for operation. Located in Highland Park, Michigan, just north of Detroit, the main building was 4 stories tall and covered more than 60 acres of floor space under one enormous roof. It was the largest factory building in the entire world at that time. Designed by the renowned and innovative industrial architect Albert Kahn, specifically for automobile manufacturing. The building was particularly notable for its revolutionary extensive use of glass windows, which provided abundant natural light throughout the factory floor and eliminated the need for interior gas lighting, improving both working conditions and safety. Workers affectionately nicknamed the building the Crystal Palace because of the enormous glass windows that covered much of the exterior walls, allowing sunlight to flood the interior spaces. But Highland Park was far more than just an impressively large building filled with machinery and workers. It was a comprehensively designed facility created specifically and exclusively for maximally efficient automobile production using the latest industrial engineering principles. Raw materials, parts, and components entered the facility at one end and flowed through a carefully orchestrated, precisely timed series of manufacturing operations, subassembly steps, and final assembly processes, emerging as complete, finished, ready-to-drive automobiles at the other end. Every single aspect of the production process, every worker motion, every parts transfer, every assembly operation was meticulously analyzed, studied, and optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum wasted time, effort, or materials. Ford hired industrial efficiency experts, time study specialists, and motion analysts to observe and document every task and operation involved in manufacturing automobiles. They broke each job down into its simplest possible component, motions, and carefully identified the fastest, least wasteful way to perform each individual operation. Workers were deliberately trained to specialize in specific, narrowly defined tasks, rather than building entire complex components or assemblies from start to finish. This extreme division of labor and task specialization allowed workers to become extraordinarily proficient and efficient at their particular assigned jobs, while simultaneously reducing the skill level, training time, and therefore labor cost required for most assembly positions. The results of these innovations were dramatic and unprecedented in American manufacturing. Assembly time for major components and subassemblies dropped significantly and continuously. Production volume increased steadily, week after week, month after month. And most importantly, for Ford's ultimate goal of universal automobile ownership, the company was able to progressively reduce the retail price of the Model T year after year, as production efficiencies steadily improved and economies of scale kicked in. The touring car model that had sold for $825 in 1908 dropped to $690 by 1912, then to $540 by 1915, then to just $360 by 1916. At its lowest point in the early 1920s, a basic Model T runabout could be purchased for an astounding $260, representing less than 3 months' wages for a typical factory worker earning decent industrial wages. Henry Ford's dream of creating truly affordable personal transportation for ordinary working people was rapidly becoming reality. But the true revolution, the innovation that would transform not just automobile manufacturing, but industrial production worldwide, and change the very nature of factory work forever, was still to come. In April 1913, Ford Motor Company and its engineering team introduced a manufacturing innovation that would have profound, lasting effects far beyond Detroit: the moving assembly line. The basic concept was inspired by several different sources that Ford and his engineers had observed and studied. Ford had personally visited grain elevators and meat-packing plants in Chicago, where agricultural products and livestock moved on conveyor systems past stationary workers, each performing a single specific task as the product moved past their workstation. He had also observed endless belt conveyors moving materials in factories. The revolutionary breakthrough came when Ford's brilliant engineers comprehensively applied this moving conveyor concept to automobile assembly, with the vehicle itself moving continuously past workers who each performed one specific, carefully defined operation as it passed their position. The first moving assembly line at Highland Park was experimentally installed for flywheel magneto assembly in April 1913. Previously, one relatively skilled worker would assemble an entire flywheel magneto, a critical and complex component of the ignition system, taking approximately 20 minutes per completed unit. With the new moving assembly line system, the magneto moved continuously past 29 different workers stationed along the line, each worker performing just a single, simple, specific operation, such as inserting one pin, tightening one bolt, or attaching one wire. The time required to assemble one complete magneto dropped dramatically to 13 minutes, then with refinements to 7 minutes, and finally to just 5 minutes per unit. The productivity improvement was extraordinary and unprecedented, and perhaps even more importantly, quality actually improved rather than declining because each worker became an absolute expert at their single, endlessly repeated task. Encouraged by this dramatic, remarkable success, Ford rapidly and aggressively expanded the moving assembly line concept throughout the entire Highland Park facility. By August 1913, moving assembly lines were operating for engine assembly and transmission assembly. By December 1913, the entire chassis assembly process, the structural backbone of every automobile, was being done on a continuously moving line over 200 feet long. A chassis that had previously required 12.5 man-hours to assemble now required just 1.5 hours from start to finish. The implications for production capacity, unit costs, and achievable production volumes were absolutely staggering and would reshape global manufacturing. With the revolutionary moving assembly line, Ford could produce far more automobiles with essentially the same workforce and factory space, dramatically reducing the direct labor cost per vehicle produced. This cost reduction allowed Ford to lower retail prices repeatedly and significantly, making the Model T affordable to an ever-widening circle of American families who had never before dreamed of owning an automobile. Lower prices drove higher sales volume, which enabled even greater economies of scale, which allowed for even lower prices. It was a virtuous, self-reinforcing cycle that would make the Model T the absolutely dominant automobile in America for nearly 2 full decades, and would make Henry Ford one of the richest men in the entire world. However, the moving assembly line created serious, significant new challenges for workers that threatened the entire system. The work was incredibly repetitive, monotonous, and mentally numbing. Each worker performed exactly the same simple task, hundreds or even thousands of times per day, day after day, week after week, with no variation or mental stimulation. The pace was relentless and completely unforgiving, controlled by the mechanical speed of the moving line rather than the worker's natural rhythm, energy level, or physical condition on any given day. Workers couldn't take breaks when they felt they needed them, couldn't slow down when they were tired or not feeling well, couldn't speed up when they felt energetic to finish early. Many workers found the work absolutely dehumanizing and mentally exhausting despite it not being particularly physically demanding. Not surprisingly, worker turnover became a severe crisis, with the annual turnover rate at Highland Park exceeding a catastrophic 370%. By 1913, Ford was constantly hiring and training new workers just to replace those who quit, which was extremely expensive, highly disruptive to production, and drastically inefficient. Henry Ford's solution to this potentially crippling turnover crisis was as revolutionary and controversial as the assembly line itself. On January 5, 1914, Ford Motor Company made an announcement that shocked the entire American business community and made international headlines. The company would pay its production workers $5 per day, more than double the prevailing wage for factory work at that time, and would simultaneously reduce the standard workday from 9 hours to 8 hours. The $5 day, as it quickly became known, was absolutely unprecedented in American industrial history and seemed economically irrational to many observers. Critics and competing manufacturers predicted certain disaster. Business leaders and industry experts said Ford was being dangerously reckless and would inevitably bankrupt his company by paying workers far more than the market-clearing wage required. They warned that Ford's misguided generosity would create impossible wage expectations among workers at other companies and destabilize regional and national labor markets. But Ford's reasoning was both shrewdly practical and remarkably far-sighted. Higher wages would directly address and solve the crippling turnover problem, saving the company enormous sums on recruiting, hiring, and training costs. Well-paid workers would be significantly more productive, more loyal to the company, more reliable in attendance, and more careful in their work. And perhaps most importantly and innovatively, higher wages would actually create customers for Ford automobiles. If Ford's own workers earned enough money to afford to buy the cars they built, they would become part of the market for Ford products rather than simply production inputs. Higher wages weren't charity or soft-hearted generosity. They were a calculated, brilliant investment in both productivity and market expansion. The impact and effects of the $5 day were immediate, dramatic, and far-reaching. Worker turnover at Ford plants dropped sharply, and suddenly worker productivity increased significantly and measurably. The company attracted the very best workers from across the entire region, and even from other parts of the country, with men traveling hundreds of miles, hoping for a coveted job at Ford. Thousands of job seekers lined up outside Ford employment offices, sometimes causing minor riots. And just as Henry Ford had confidently predicted, Ford workers began buying Model T automobiles in large numbers, becoming loyal, satisfied customers. For the products they personally manufactured during their work shifts, the $5 day had solved Ford's labor problems while simultaneously expanding the market for its products. By 1916, Ford Motor Company was producing more than 700,000 Model T automobiles per year, an absolutely astounding figure that dwarfed all competitors combined. The car was now available in multiple convenient body styles to serve different needs, from the basic runabout for individuals, to enclosed sedans for families, to delivery vehicles for businesses, to trucks for farmers and merchants. But every variant was based on exactly the same standardized chassis and identical mechanical components, and every single one was painted black Ford, famously, somewhat jokingly, but also quite seriously said that customers could have any color they wanted, as long as it was black. This wasn't just Henry Ford's sense of humor. It was a completely deliberate, carefully considered decision based on the practical fact that black enamel paint dried significantly faster than other available colors, allowing faster production throughput and reducing the amount of expensive factory space and capital tied up in inventory awaiting paint to fully dry and cure. The Model T was fundamentally transforming America and American society in profound, lasting ways that even Henry Ford probably didn't fully anticipate or imagine. It was bringing unprecedented personal mobility to rural areas that had been isolated for centuries, allowing farmers to quickly get to town for supplies, services, medical care, entertainment, and social interaction, rather than making infrequent, time-consuming trips by horse and wagon. It was dramatically expanding possibilities for tourism, recreation, and family vacations, as families could now practically travel to distant places and attractions that had previously been completely inaccessible. It was changing courtship patterns and family life in unexpected ways, as young people gained unprecedented independence and mobility that previous generations had never experienced. The automobile was rapidly becoming absolutely central to the American way of life and the American conception of personal freedom, and Ford Motor Company was the company making this revolutionary transformation possible and accessible for millions of American families of modest means. The revolution that Henry Ford had dreamed of as a young farm boy tinkering in a backyard shed was now fundamentally reshaping American society in ways that even he hadn't fully imagined. Chapter 3. The Assembly Line Changes Everything, 1913 to 1927. The introduction of the moving assembly line in 1913 marked a watershed moment, not just for Ford Motor Company, but for global manufacturing. By 1914, the Highland Park plant was operating at peak efficiency, with the entire Model T production process synchronized along moving assembly lines. Raw materials entered one end of the vast factory complex and emerged as complete drivable automobiles at the other end in a continuous orchestrated flow that seemed almost magical to visitors and observers. The productivity gains were staggering beyond anything previously achieved in manufacturing history. In 1912, before the moving assembly line, Ford produced approximately 170,000 Model T automobiles, with a workforce of about 14,000 workers. By 1914, with the assembly line in full operation, the company produced over 300,000 vehicles, with essentially the same number of workers. By 1916, production exceeded 750,000 units annually. And at the peak of Model T production in the early 1920s, Ford was building over 2 million cars per year, accounting for more than half of all automobiles produced in the United States. This unprecedented production volume allowed Ford to continue lowering prices year after year. The relentless price reductions opened the automobile market to progressively broader segments of American society. By 1916, a basic Model T could be purchased for less than $400. By 1924, the price had dropped to just $290 for a runabout model. At this price point, automobile ownership was within reach of virtually any working family in America. A factory worker earning $5 a day at Ford could save enough to buy a Model T in just 2 to 3 months. The automobile was no longer a luxury item for the wealthy. It had become accessible to ordinary people. The social and economic impact of mass automobile ownership transformed America in profound and lasting ways. Rural isolation, which had defined American farm life for centuries, began to disappear. Farmers could now drive to town in 30 minutes rather than spending half a day traveling by horse and wagon. This accessibility meant that rural families could shop at better stores, attend better schools, access better medical care, and participate more fully in the social and cultural life of nearby towns and cities. The automobile was literally bringing rural America into the modern world. In cities, the Model T changed commuting patterns and urban development. Workers were no longer confined to living within walking distance of factories or along streetcar lines. They could live in emerging suburbs and drive to work, a pattern that would fundamentally reshape American cities over the coming decades. Shopping patterns changed as people could travel across town or to neighboring communities for goods and services. The entire spatial organization of American metropolitan areas began to shift in response to widespread automobile ownership. The Model T also changed American courtship, family life, and youth culture in unexpected ways. Young people gained unprecedented freedom and independence. A date in a Model T meant privacy away from parental supervision, the ability to travel to neighboring towns for entertainment, and access to spaces and places that had been difficult or impossible to reach before. This new mobility was both liberating and controversial. Parents and moralists worried about unsupervised young people in automobiles, fearing that this freedom would lead to moral decline and improper behavior. These concerns were widely discussed in newspapers, magazines, and church pulpits. The rise of mass automobile ownership created an entirely new economic ecosystem that transformed the American economy. Gas stations spread across the country, often located at strategic intersections and in town centers. repair shops and service garages opened to maintain and fix automobiles. Parts suppliers, tire manufacturers, and accessories companies emerged to serve the growing market. Motels and roadside restaurants appeared along major routes to serve travelers. The road paving industry boomed as communities demanded better roads for their automobiles. State and federal highway systems were planned and constructed, connecting cities and regions that had previously been poorly linked. The economic ripple effects of mass automobile ownership touched virtually every sector of the American economy, creating jobs and opportunities that hadn't existed before. Henry Ford became one of the most famous and admired men in America during this period. He was seen as a champion of the common man, someone who had made a product of the wealthy accessible to ordinary people. His business innovations, particularly the $5 day and the moving assembly line, were studied and imitated by manufacturers around the world. Business leaders, government officials, and academics visited Highland Park to observe Ford's methods firsthand. Delegations came from Europe, Asia, and South America to study what became known as Fordism, the combination of mass production, high wages, and low prices that created both prosperity and broad-based consumption. But Ford's fame and success also brought criticism and controversy. Labor activists noted that despite the $5 day, Ford workers faced intense pressure, monotonous work, and strict discipline. The company's sociological department, which investigated workers' private lives to determine eligibility for the full $5 wage, was widely criticized as paternalistic, invasive, and an inappropriate intrusion into workers' personal affairs. Ford's fierce opposition to labor unions and his use of company security forces to prevent union organizing drew condemnation from labor advocates and progressive reformers. Ford himself became increasingly controversial beyond his business activities. In 1919, he purchased a small newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. He used this publication as a platform to express his views on various political, social, and economic subjects. Unfortunately, from 1920 to 1927, Ford allowed the Dearborn Independent to publish a series of viciously anti-Semitic articles under the title The International Jew. These articles propagated conspiracy theories blaming Jewish financiers and business leaders for various social and economic problems. They were based on the fraudulent protocols of the Elders of Zion and other discredited anti-Semitic material. The publication of these articles seriously damaged Ford's reputation among many Americans and drew widespread condemnation from religious leaders, civic organizations, and editorial pages across the country. Jewish organizations organized boycotts of Ford products. Prominent Americans, including President Woodrow Wilson, publicly criticized Ford's anti-Semitism. Eventually, in 1927, after several lawsuits and intense public pressure, Ford issued an apology, shut down the Dearborn Independent, and stopped publishing anti-Semitic material. However, the damage to his reputation was lasting, and his anti-Semitic writings would later be cited approvingly by Adolf Hitler and Nazi propagandists. Despite these personal controversies, the Model T continued to dominate the American automobile market through the early 1920s. But by the mid-20s, cracks were beginning to appear in Ford's market dominance. Competitor General Motors, under the brilliant leadership of Alfred Sloan, was taking a fundamentally different approach to the automobile business. Instead of offering a single model at a single price point like Ford, GM offered multiple brands serving different market segments. Chevrolet for budget-conscious buyers, Pontiac and Oldsmobile for the middle market, Buick for the affluent, and Cadillac for the wealthy. This strategy, which Sloan called a car for every purse and purpose, gave customers choices and allowed GM to capture sales across the entire automobile market. General Motors also understood that American consumers were becoming more sophisticated and demanding. They wanted cars with more features, more comfort, more style, and more variety. They wanted closed bodies to protect them from weather rather than open touring cars. They wanted self-starters instead of hand cranks. They wanted more power and higher speeds for the improving road networks. They wanted hydraulic brakes that were more effective than the mechanical brakes on the Model T. And crucially, they wanted visual variety and the ability to express their personality and status through their choice of automobile. GM pioneered the concept of planned obsolescence and annual model changes in the automobile industry. Models would be restyled every year, with enough visual changes to make last year's model look dated and old-fashioned. This encouraged consumers to trade in their cars more frequently, creating continuous demand for new vehicles and generating more sales and profits. GM also pioneered consumer credit through its GMAC financing subsidiary, making higher-priced vehicles affordable through monthly payment plans. These innovations allowed GM to sell more expensive, more profitable vehicles to customers who couldn't afford to pay cash up front. Ford, by stark contrast, stuck with the Model T design with only minor incremental changes year after year. Henry Ford was philosophically opposed to frequent model changes, viewing them as wasteful and manipulative. He believed that a well-designed, well-built car should last many years, and that encouraging people to replace perfectly functional vehicles just for style was morally wrong. He also resisted many mechanical improvements that consumers wanted, believing that the Model T's simplicity was more important than additional features. When his son Edsel and other company executives urged him to update the Model T or develop an entirely new model, Henry stubbornly refused. The Model T had been successful for nearly 2 decades. Why change a winning formula? But by 1925, it was becoming painfully clear that the automotive market had changed, and Ford had not changed with it. Model T sales began to decline for the first time in the car's history. Chevrolet, which GM positioned as a slightly more expensive but significantly more modern alternative to the Model T, was rapidly gaining market share. The Chevrolet offered a more powerful engine, smoother ride, better brakes, more comfort, and contemporary styling, all for just slightly more money than a Model T. Increasingly, consumers were willing to pay the price difference for these advantages. Ford dealers across the country complained that they couldn't sell Model T vehicles against more modern competitors. Customers would come into Ford showrooms, look at the Model T, then go to Chevrolet dealerships and buy the more modern car. The used car market was flooded with Model T Fords, depressing resale values and making new purchases less attractive. Edsel Ford, who officially served as president of the company but had limited real authority because his father controlled all major decisions, pleaded with Henry to develop a new model. Other executives echoed this urgent plea. But Henry remained stubbornly resistant to change. Finally, by early 1927, even Henry Ford could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that the Model T era was over. In May 1927, Ford made a momentous announcement the company would discontinue the Model T and develop an entirely new automobile. It was the end of an era. The Model T had been in continuous production for 19 years, longer than any other automobile model before or since. More than 15 million Model T vehicles had been built, accounting for more than half of all automobiles produced in America during that period. The Model T had truly put America on wheels, fulfilling Henry Ford's vision of making the automobile accessible to ordinary people. The decision to end Model T production and develop a new model required shutting down all of Ford's factories for 6 months while they were completely retooled for production of the new vehicle. During this period, Ford built no vehicles and generated no revenue, a bold and risky decision that few other companies could have survived. 100,000 workers were laid off during the retooling period, causing significant hardship for them and their families, and creating serious economic difficulties in Detroit and other communities dependent on Ford employment. It was a massive, disruptive undertaking that involved redesigning and rebuilding factories, creating thousands of new tools and fixtures, retraining the entire workforce on completely new assembly procedures, and rebuilding the supply chain. Competitors, particularly General Motors, took full advantage of Ford's absence from the market. With Ford not selling cars for 6 months, GM aggressively marketed its brands and captured market share that Ford would struggle to reclaim. Many industry observers wondered whether Ford had made a fatal strategic error by shutting down production entirely, rather than transitioning gradually to the new model, while maintaining some Model T production. The financial cost and lost market opportunity were substantial. But Henry Ford, now 64 years old, and having just made the difficult decision to abandon his greatest success, was determined that the new Ford automobile would be thoroughly modern and competitive with anything General Motors or any other manufacturer offered. The replacement for the beloved Model T would need to be dramatically better in every way to justify the weight, the expense, and the risk. The stage was set for the introduction of the Model A, a car that would need to prove that Henry Ford could still compete and innovate in the rapidly changing automobile industry of the late 1920s. Chapter 4. Competition and Challenges, 1927 to 1945. The months between May and December of 1927 were anxious times for Ford Motor Company and for the tens of thousands of workers and suppliers whose livelihoods depended on Ford's success. With Model T production completely halted and factories sitting silent and idle, the company generated no revenue while continuing to face substantial fixed expenses. Competitors, particularly General Motors and its Chevrolet brand, took aggressive advantage of Ford's absence from the marketplace. Many industry observers and business analysts wondered openly whether Henry Ford had made a catastrophic strategic error that might permanently damage or even destroy his company. But Henry Ford, though now in his mid-60s and no longer the young innovator who had revolutionized automobile manufacturing, remained confident in his vision and abilities. He worked personally and intensively on the design of the new car, now designated the Model A, just as he had worked on the original Model A back in 1903 and on the Model T in 1907. He was absolutely determined that this new vehicle would be thoroughly modern, feature-rich, and competitive with anything General Motors or any other manufacturer could offer, while still maintaining Ford's traditional commitment to value and affordability for ordinary families. The new Model A Ford was finally revealed to an eager public on December 2nd, 1927. The anticipation and excitement were extraordinary, perhaps unprecedented for a consumer product. More than 10 million Americans visited Ford showrooms in the first 36 hours just to see the new car, creating massive crowds at dealerships across the country. In New York City, over 100,000 people crowded into Madison Square Garden for a public unveiling, with police having to be called to control the enormous enthusiastic crowds. The excitement and public interest were reminiscent of a major cultural event, rather than simply a product introduction, and the Model A did not disappoint the eager public. It was a thoroughly modern automobile, representing a dramatic leap forward from the Model T in virtually every aspect of design, engineering, features, and capabilities. It had a significantly more powerful four-cylinder engine producing 40 horsepower, nearly double the Model T's output and providing substantially better performance. It could cruise comfortably at 55 miles per hour on good roads, dramatically faster than the Model T's more modest capabilities. It had a conventional 3-speed sliding gear transmission with a floor-mounted shifter, making it easier and more intuitive to drive than the Model T's unique planetary transmission that had required learning specialized driving techniques. Most importantly, for many buyers, it had a modern electric starter as standard equipment, completely eliminating the hand crank that had been necessary on the Model T, and that many people, especially women, had found difficult or intimidating to use. The Model A came in a wide variety of attractive body styles and in multiple appealing colors, a sharp and deliberate departure from Henry Ford's famous statement about the Model T being available in any color as long as it was black. Buyers could now choose from Arabia Blue, Dawn Gray, Niagara Blue, and several other attractive color options. The body designs were modern and stylish, with sleeker, more contemporary lines and better proportions than the Model T's tall, boxy, utilitarian appearance. The interior was far more comfortable and refined, with better seats, improved instrument panel, more weather protection in closed models, and generally higher quality fit and finish throughout. The price was remarkably reasonable and competitive, starting at just $485 for the basic Roadster model. This was somewhat more expensive than the Model T had been in its final years, but the Model A offered dramatically more value, features, and capability for the additional cost. It was price competitive with Chevrolet and other competing brands, while offering what Ford believed was superior quality, performance, and durability. The American public's response was immediate, overwhelming, and sustained. Within just 3 weeks of the Model A's public introduction, Ford had received over 400,000 firm orders from eager customers. Production struggled to keep pace with demand for many months, and customers routinely waited a year or more to receive delivery of their ordered vehicle. The Model A was clearly a major success, vindicating Henry Ford's risky decision to completely abandon the Model T and develop an entirely new car. By the end of 1928, Ford had produced and sold over 600,000 Model A vehicles and had successfully regained its position as America's largest automobile manufacturer, surpassing General Motors in unit sales. Henry Ford, who had been written off by many critics as too old, too stubborn, and too out of touch to compete in the modern automobile market, had proven the doubters wrong once again. However, the competition from General Motors remained formidable and was intensifying rather than diminishing. Alfred Sloan's strategic approach of offering multiple brands at different price points, combined with frequent model changes, extensive advertising, and aggressive promotion of consumer credit, was proving highly effective and resilient. General Motors understood deeply that automobiles had evolved beyond purely functional transportation devices. They were now style statements, status symbols, and expressions of personality and aspiration. Consumers increasingly wanted the newest designs, the latest features, and the ability to display their taste and success through their choice of vehicle. General Motors was superbly positioned to serve these evolving consumer desires. GM had also introduced and perfected the concept of planned obsolescence into the automobile industry. Models would be restyled every year with sufficient visual changes and feature improvements to make last year's model look obviously dated and less desirable. This strategy encouraged consumers to trade in their cars more frequently, every 2 to 3 years rather than driving them for a decade or more, as had been common with the Model T. More frequent trade-ins created continuous reliable demand for new vehicles and generated higher lifetime revenue per customer. Combined with GM's consumer credit offerings through GMAC, which made expensive vehicles affordable through manageable monthly payments, General Motors had created a powerful, sustainable business model. Ford, by contrast, maintained the Model A design with only relatively minor changes and updates for several years, following the same philosophy that had guided Model T production. Henry Ford remained philosophically opposed to frequent model changes and artificial obsolescence, viewing these practices as wasteful, manipulative, and morally questionable. He believed that a well-designed, well-built car should provide many years of reliable service, and that encouraging people to replace perfectly functional vehicles, primarily for style or status, was wrong. This principled philosophical stance, however admirable from an ethical perspective, put Ford at a significant competitive disadvantage as consumer preferences and expectations continued to evolve. The Ford Motor Company organization itself was becoming increasingly problematic and dysfunctional. Henry Ford, now in his late 60s, ruled the company as an absolute autocrat with no effective checks on his authority or judgment. In 1919, he had systematically bought out all minority shareholders at substantial cost, making Ford Motor Company entirely family-owned with Henry controlling the overwhelming majority of shares. This meant he answered to no board of independent directors, no outside shareholders, and essentially no one but himself. He could make any decision, no matter how questionable or risky, without needing approval or even consultation. Ford's management style had always been unconventional, but it became increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and counterproductive as he aged. He promoted and demoted executives based on whim, personal loyalty, and favoritism rather than merit or performance. He deliberately pitted subordinates against each other, encouraging internal competition and conflict rather than cooperation and teamwork. He actively resisted organizational structure and systematic planning, preferring to make all important decisions himself based on intuition rather than delegating authority to professional managers. Talented executives who disagreed with him or showed too much independence were fired, marginalized, or driven to quit. The result was a company that suffered from lack of systematic management, inadequate planning, poor coordination, and overdependence on one aging man's increasingly questionable judgment. Ford's son, Edsel, who officially served as president of the company from 1919 onward, found himself in an impossible, frustrating position. Edsel had excellent instincts about automobile design, consumer preferences, and market trends. He understood that consumers wanted style, comfort, and features, not just basic, utilitarian transportation. He advocated strongly for safety features like hydraulic brakes, which were demonstrably superior to the mechanical brakes Ford continued using. He pushed for more powerful engines, more comfortable interiors, more attractive styling. But Henry Ford consistently overruled or undermined him, often publicly humiliating Edsel in front of other executives and workers, questioning his judgment and manhood. Edsel's ideas were regularly rejected, not because they were wrong, but simply because they weren't Henry's ideas. The contrast between the orderly, systematically managed General Motors and the chaotic, personality-driven Ford Motor Company became increasingly stark and consequential through the 1930s. GM had professional managers throughout the organization, clear and rational lines of authority and responsibility, systematic planning and forecasting processes, sophisticated financial controls, and data-driven decision-making based on market research and careful analysis. Ford had Henry's hunches, sudden unpredictable reversals of policy, favoritism, and an increasingly cult-like atmosphere built around the aging founder's personality and reputation. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash in October 1929 and deepened dramatically through the early 1930s, created enormous new challenges for the entire American automobile industry. Car sales collapsed as millions of Americans lost their jobs and couldn't afford even necessities, much less expensive durable goods like automobiles. Ford's annual sales dropped catastrophically from over 1.5 million vehicles in 1929 to less than 450,000 in 1932. The company laid off tens of thousands of workers, leaving them struggling to survive. Factories operated at a small fraction of their capacity or sat completely idle for months at a time. Henry Ford's response to the Depression was contradictory and revealed his conflicted views about business, workers, and social responsibility. On one hand, he expressed public sympathy for unemployed workers and frequently claimed that business leaders had a moral responsibility to maintain employment even during hard economic times. On the other hand, he slashed wages repeatedly, laid off workers by the tens of thousands without apparent concern for their welfare, and fought viciously against any attempts at unionization. He seemed unable or unwilling to reconcile his paternalistic view of himself as a benevolent employer with the harsh realities of running a business during an unprecedented economic catastrophe. The early and mid-1930s saw increasing labor unrest at Ford facilities as workers, desperate and angry about layoffs, wage cuts, and harsh working conditions, began organizing efforts to form unions. The American Federation of Labor and later the more militant Congress of Industrial Organizations attempted to establish union representation at Ford plants. Henry Ford was absolutely, viscerally opposed to unions, viewing them as outside interference in his relationship with his workers and as fundamentally un-American. He employed Harry Bennett, a former Navy boxer, street brawler, and tough guy, to head the company's service department, which functioned essentially as a private security force and intelligence operation. Bennett's service department quickly became notorious for its intimidation tactics, violence, and brutality. Workers who were suspected of union sympathies were beaten, threatened, followed home, and often fired on the spot without explanation. Union organizers were attacked, sometimes severely. In March 1932, a protest march by unemployed workers to the Ford Rouge complex in Dearborn turned violent when Dearborn police and Ford security guards opened fire on the crowd of unarmed demonstrators, killing 4 workers and wounding dozens more. The Dearborn Massacre, as it became known in labor circles, drew national condemnation, seriously damaged Ford's public image, and became a rallying point for the growing labor movement. Despite these serious troubles and controversies, Ford did introduce some notable innovations during the early Depression years. In 1932, the company launched the flathead Vive 8 engine, a significant technological breakthrough that brought powerful 8-cylinder engine performance to moderately priced automobiles for the first time. Previously, V8 engines had been available only in expensive luxury cars. Due to their complexity and manufacturing cost, Ford's engineers developed manufacturing techniques that made V8 production economically feasible at reasonable prices. The flathead V8 gave Ford vehicles significantly more power and performance than 4-cylinder competitors and helped keep Ford competitive through the difficult mid-30s. It was perhaps Henry Ford's last great engineering achievement and contribution to automotive technology. The V8 engine helped Ford maintain competitive position through the Depression years, but it couldn't overcome the company's growing organizational problems and strategic challenges. By the middle of the 1930s, despite its illustrious history and famous founder, Ford Motor Company was clearly losing ground to its competitors. General Motors had definitively surpassed Ford in total sales and was steadily pulling ahead. Chrysler, founded only in 1925 by former GM executive Walter Chrysler, had also surpassed Ford to become the second-largest American automaker. The company that had once produced more than half of America's automobiles was now a distant, struggling third place, and the gap was widening year by year. Henry Ford, now in his 70s, seemed increasingly out of touch with modern business realities and market conditions. He clung to outdated ideas about manufacturing, management, and consumer preferences. He resisted suggestions and advice from Edsel and other executives who better understood changing market dynamics. Most troublingly, he relied increasingly on Harry Bennett, whose brutality, incompetence in business matters, and personal agenda were systematically undermining the company from within Ford Motor Company. One of the greatest success stories in American business history was heading toward serious crisis. It would take a world war and a family tragedy to finally break Henry Ford's grip on the company he had founded and allow desperately needed change and modernization. Chapter 5, War and Tragedy, 1941 to 1947. The early 1940s brought both enormous challenges and unexpected opportunities for Ford Motor Company. America's entry into World War II in December 1941 transformed the American economy and created massive demand for military vehicles, aircraft, and equipment. Ford's huge manufacturing capacity and expertise in mass production made it critically important to the war effort. Despite Henry Ford's well-known pacifist beliefs and his strong opposition to American involvement in foreign wars, the company began receiving substantial government contracts to produce military trucks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and other war materiel essential to defeating the Axis powers. After Pearl Harbor, Ford Motor Company's participation in war production expanded dramatically and became central to America's military capabilities. The company converted automobile plans to produce thousands of military trucks and jeeps. It built tank engines and armored vehicles. Most impressively and importantly, Ford constructed the massive Willow Run plant specifically for aircraft production. At its peak operational efficiency, this enormous facility was producing one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour, an absolutely remarkable achievement in applying mass production techniques to complex aircraft manufacturing. Over 8,000 B-24 bombers came from Willow Run during the war, making crucial contributions to America's strategic bombing campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. Ford also produced countless other items for the military. Jeeps that became iconic vehicles of the American Armed Forces, amphibious vehicles for beach landings, tank engines, aircraft engine superchargers, and numerous other critical components and systems. The company's deep expertise in mass production and its huge manufacturing capacity made it invaluable to the American war effort. More than 4 million military vehicles and engines came from Ford factories during the war years. Henry Ford, despite his philosophical pacifism and strong anti-war beliefs, could take some pride and satisfaction in the fact that Ford products were helping America and its allies defeat fascism and totalitarianism. But in May 1943, personal tragedy struck the Ford family with devastating force. Edsel Ford, Henry's only son, died at the tragically young age of 49 from stomach cancer, undulant fever, and other complications likely exacerbated by years of extreme stress. His death was an enormous blow to the family, personally, and to the company, strategically. Edsel had been the crucial bridge between Henry Ford's increasingly outdated ideas and methods and the modern automobile industry's realities and requirements. He had been a check, however inadequate and often overruled, on Harry Bennett's worst impulses and most destructive behaviors. And he had been carefully, if imperfectly, groomed to eventually succeed his father as head of the company and guide it into the post-war era. With Edsel gone and no clear successor ready, Henry Ford, now 80 years old and in declining health, reassumed the presidency of Ford Motor Company. But he was no longer the sharp-minded, energetic innovator who had revolutionized the automobile industry decades earlier. He was increasingly forgetful, sometimes confused and disoriented, and clearly unable to handle the immensely complex demands of running a major corporation during wartime. He made erratic, contradictory decisions that confused subordinates. He frequently forgot conversations and decisions from just hours or days earlier. He sometimes seemed unaware of important developments within his own company and the broader war effort. Even worse, from the company's perspective, Harry Bennett seized this opportunity to dramatically expand his power and influence. With Edsel dead and Henry failing mentally, Bennett positioned himself as the de facto head of Ford Motor Company in all but title. He systematically fired or drove out executives who had been loyal to Edsel or who represented professional management rather than Bennett's thuggish personal loyalty system. He intimidated anyone who opposed him or questioned his authority. He seemed to be deliberately maneuvering to take complete control of Ford Motor Company, perhaps even planning to push out the Ford family entirely and install himself as permanent head of the company. But Bennett had not adequately reckoned with the determination and resourcefulness of Edsel's widow, Eleanor Clay Ford. Eleanor was a strong-willed, intelligent woman from one of Detroit's most prominent and wealthy families. She was absolutely determined that Ford Motor Company would remain in Ford family control and would pass to her sons, not to Harry Bennett or anyone else outside the family. She formed a crucial alliance with Clara Ford, Henry's wife, who shared Eleanor's concerns about Bennett's growing power and his obviously destructive influence on the company and on Henry. Together, these two strong women began applying steady, relentless pressure on Henry to hand control of the company to Edsell's oldest son, Henry Ford II, who was currently serving in the United States Navy. Henry Ford II, just 25 years old, and with minimal business experience beyond some pre-war time, working at Ford, was released from the Navy in August 1945 at his grandmother Clara's direct request to military authorities. He returned to Detroit and was immediately thrown into an intense, complex battle for control of Ford Motor Company. His grandfather, Henry, still nominally controlled the company, but was clearly declining mentally and physically, sometimes not even recognizing his own grandson. Harry Bennett continued scheming and maneuvering to consolidate his control and eliminate the Ford family from power. The company itself was hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate, losing approximately $10 million per month. Employee morale was terrible throughout the organization. The organizational structure had essentially collapsed into chaos. Nobody knew who was actually in charge or who had authority to make decisions. Clara Ford, seeing the company her husband had built crumbling and recognizing that Henry was no longer capable of effective leadership, delivered a direct ultimatum to her husband that finally broke through his resistance and confusion. Either hand control of the company to young Henry Ford II immediately, or she would sell her substantial stock holdings and allow the company to be acquired by outsiders, ending Ford family ownership forever. This threat finally penetrated Henry's deteriorating mental state and forced him to act. On September 21st, 1945, in a brief ceremony, Henry Ford II was named president of Ford Motor Company, with full authority to run the company as he determined best. He was given complete operational control without interference from his grandfather or anyone else. Henry Ford II's first and most urgent priority was eliminating Harry Bennett and his corrupt, incompetent cronies who had done so much damage. Within just days of taking office, young Henry fired Bennett and his key lieutenants throughout the organization. Bennett, apparently anticipating his termination, had already cleaned out his office and departed. He left behind a loaded revolver in his desk drawer, perhaps a final intimidation attempt, perhaps just a careless oversight. With Bennett and his associates gone, Henry II could begin the enormous, urgent task of rebuilding and modernizing the badly damaged company. The situation he inherited was genuinely dire and potentially fatal. Ford Motor Company was losing approximately $10 million every single month, an unsustainable burn rate that threatened bankruptcy within months, if not corrected. The company had virtually no modern accounting or financial control systems. Executives literally didn't know whether individual operations were profitable or losing money. There was no rational organizational structure. Nobody had clear responsibilities or understood reporting relationships. Product planning was haphazard and reactive rather than systematic and strategic. Manufacturing operations were inefficient by modern standards and falling behind competitors technologically. Quality control was poor and inconsistent. Labor relations were poisonous and confrontational, with strikes and work stoppages common. The company that had once been the world's largest and most admired automaker was now a dysfunctional organizational disaster on the verge of collapse. Henry Ford II, despite his youth and inexperience, understood that he desperately needed help from people with expertise and skills he didn't possess. In a bold, unconventional move, he hired a group of 10 former Army Air Force officers who had specialized in statistical analysis, operations research, and organizational management during the war. Led by Charles "Tex" Thornton, this group quickly became known throughout the industry and business press as the Whiz Kids for their youth confidence, analytical abilities, and aggressive approach to problem-solving. They brought modern analytical and management techniques to Ford, systematizing operations, implementing rigorous financial controls, and creating rational organizational structures with clear lines of authority and responsibility, and generally bringing order out of chaos. Henry II also hired Ernest Breech, an experienced former General Motors executive who understood how to run large, complex organizations effectively. Breech had successfully managed major operations at GM and understood the modern automobile industry deeply. Together, Henry Ford II and Ernest Breech began the painful, expensive, time-consuming process of completely rebuilding Ford Motor Company from the ground up. They systematically cleaned house throughout the organization, firing hundreds of managers and executives who had been promoted for personal loyalty to Bennett rather than competence or performance. They hired professional managers from other companies, bringing in critically needed expertise and outside perspectives that Ford desperately lacked. They implemented modern accounting systems and financial management controls so executives could actually understand the company's financial performance and make informed decisions. They reorganized the company along rational divisional lines, similar to General Motors' proven structure. They invested billions in new product development to create competitive vehicles. They modernized factories with new equipment and updated manufacturing techniques. It was agonizing, expensive, and exhausting work that consumed years and tested everyone involved. But gradually, step by difficult step, Ford Motor Company began to stabilize and recover. Product quality slowly improved. New competitive models were developed and introduced. The company returned to profitability after years of losses. Labor relations improved significantly after Ford finally, belatedly, recognized the United Auto Workers Union in 1941, becoming last of Detroit's big three automakers to accept unionization. Henry Ford, the legendary founder who had revolutionized manufacturing and put America on wheels, played no role whatsoever in this crucial transformation and recovery. After stepping down and handing control to his grandson, he retreated to his Dearborn estate, Fair Lane. His mental and physical health continued declining steadily. On April 7, 1947, at age 83, Henry Ford died at Fair Lane from a cerebral hemorrhage. He passed peacefully in the grand mansion he had built at the height of his success. His funeral was attended by thousands of people, including ordinary workers and citizens who lined up for hours in cold spring rain to pay respects to the man who had made automobiles affordable and accessible to millions of American families. President Harry Truman sent personal condolences, as did leaders from around the world who recognized Ford's historical importance. Whatever Henry Ford's serious flaws, mistakes, and moral failures, and they were substantial and cannot be minimized, his achievements and contributions were genuinely extraordinary and historically significant. He had revolutionized manufacturing with the assembly line. He had transformed transportation by making automobiles affordable. He had helped create the modern consumer economy. He had changed how Americans lived, worked, and interacted with their communities and country. But the Ford Motor Company he left behind was being systematically rebuilt by a new generation that would have to compete in a post-war world dramatically different from the one Henry Ford had known and dominated. The company's survival and future success would depend entirely on its ability to adapt, innovate, compete effectively, and learn from the painful mistakes of the past. The transformation had begun under challenging circumstances, but the really hard work of building a modern, competitive, professionally managed Ford Motor Company was just getting started in earnest. Chapter 6. The Grandson's Rescue, 1945 to 1960. The late 1940s and entire 1950s were years of intensive reconstruction and modernization for Ford Motor Company. Under the determined leadership of Henry Ford II, supported by Ernest Breech and the analytical whiz kids, the company was systematically rebuilt from its foundations. This wasn't just organizational restructuring or cost-cutting. It was a complete transformation of a company that had been run by instinct and personal authority into a modern corporation run by systems, data, and professional management. The cultural change was as profound as the organizational change. Under Henry Ford, the company had been a personality cult where everyone deferred to the founder's wishes, no matter how unrealistic or outdated. Now Ford Motor Company was becoming a meritocracy where competence and results mattered more than personal loyalty. Professional managers were making informed decisions based on data and analysis rather than hunches. Planning processes were established to coordinate activities across divisions and functions. It was painful for many longtime Ford employees who were used to the old ways, but it was absolutely necessary for survival. One of the first priorities was new product development. Ford's lineup in the late 40s consisted mostly of warmed-over pre-war designs that looked dated compared to GM and Chrysler's new models. In 1949, Ford introduced completely redesigned models across its Ford and Mercury lines. These new cars had modern styling with smooth sides and integrated fenders, replacing the bulbous pre-war look. They had independent front suspension for better ride quality. They were well received and helped Ford regain market share. But Ford's ambitions went beyond catching up. The company wanted to reclaim the innovative spirit that had made it great. The most ambitious project was the Continental Mark II, introduced for 1956. This was a personal luxury car priced above even Cadillac at over $10,000. It was beautiful, elegant, and exceptionally well built. But it was a financial disaster, losing money on every unit. Production ended after just 2 years. More successful was the Thunderbird, introduced in 1955. While Chevy's Corvette was a pure sports car, the Thunderbird was a personal luxury car that happened to be sporty. It had a V8 engine, sleek styling, and enough comfort for everyday use. The Thunderbird vastly outsold the Corvette and established a new category. The mid-50s also saw Ford briefly emphasize safety features, offering padded dashboards and seatbelts as options in 1956. Unfortunately, consumers showed little interest and competitors mocked the campaign. Ford quickly abandoned the safety focus after sales suffered. Despite these efforts, Ford remained solidly in second place behind GM throughout the 50s. This frustrated Henry Ford II, who desperately wanted to reclaim the #1 position. In the late 50s, Ford launched the Edsel, named after Henry II's father. The company invested over $250 million developing this new brand, intended to fill the gap between Ford and Mercury. The Edsel, introduced in September 1957, became one of history's greatest product failures. The styling was controversial, particularly the vertical grille. The car launched just as a recession hit. Quality problems plagued early production. The entire mid-priced car segment was shrinking. Edsel sales were far below projections. Ford discontinued it in November 1959 after less than 3 years, losing an estimated $350 million. The Edsel failure was embarrassing but educational. The company learned that massive investment and publicity couldn't guarantee success. Consumers were sophisticated and couldn't be manipulated into buying something they didn't want. This humbling lesson would inform Ford's approach to future product development. By 1960, Ford Motor Company had been completely transformed from the dysfunctional wreck Henry Ford II's inherited in 1945. The company was profitable, well-managed, and competitive. It had modern facilities, strong products, professional management, and good labor relations. Market share had stabilized and was even growing. The foundation was laid for future success. But the real breakthrough was still ahead. Chapter 7. The Mustang Era, 1960 to 1973. The early 1960s brought a new energy to Ford Motor Company. The company had recovered from its near-death experience and was looking for ways to capture the imagination of a new generation. The baby boomers, born after World War II, were coming of age and entering the car market. They had grown up in prosperity and wanted something more exciting than their parents' sedans. Lee Iacocca, a rising star at Ford, understood this demographic shift. Born Lido Anthony Iacocca to Italian immigrant parents, he had worked his way up through Ford's sales and marketing organization, through talent and relentless ambition. By 1960, he was general manager of the Ford division and looking for a product that would make his mark. Iacocca's vision was a car that combined sporty styling with affordability. It would appeal to young buyers who wanted style and performance but couldn't afford a Corvette or European sports car. The car would be based on existing platforms to keep costs down, but it would look distinctive and offer numerous options so buyers could personalize it. The result was the Mustang, introduced on April 17, 1964. Based on the humble Falcon platform, the Mustang had long hood, short deck styling that looked far more expensive than it was. It was available with everything from a modest 6-cylinder engine to powerful V8s. Buyers could choose from numerous options and packages, creating a car that felt personal and unique. The base price was just $23,668, affordable for young buyers, but with options, the price could easily double, generating excellent profits for Ford. It was brilliant product positioning that would be studied in business schools for decades. The public response exceeded even optimistic projections. Ford had expected first-year sales of 100,000 units. Instead, over 400,000 Mustangs sold in the first year, and over 1 million in the first 18 months. The Mustang appeared on the covers of both Time and Newsweek in the same week. Celebrities bought them. The car became a cultural phenomenon. The Mustang created the pony car segment. Competitors rushed out rivals, including the Camaro, Firebird, and Barracuda. But Mustang maintained its leadership position. More importantly, it proved Ford could create exciting products that captured public imagination. The Mustang's success made Iacocca a star. He was promoted to executive vice president in 1967 and president in 1970. He seemed destined to eventually succeed Henry Ford II as chairman. But tensions were building. Iacocca was charismatic and ambitious. He enjoyed the spotlight and took credit for Ford's successes. Henry Ford II, while respecting Iacocca's abilities, was uncomfortable with anyone who might overshadow him. The clash of these two strong personalities would eventually have consequences. Meanwhile, the late 60s and early 70s brought new challenges. Federal safety and emissions regulations forced expensive redesigns and new technologies. The oil crisis of 1973 made fuel economy crucial. Japanese imports were gaining market share with smaller, more efficient cars. The muscle car era that had made the Mustang famous was ending. Ford responded with smaller, more fuel-efficient models. The Pinto, introduced in 1970, was Ford's answer to imports. It was small, simple, and affordable, with a base price under $2,000. It sold well initially, but the Pinto would become infamous for a serious safety flaw. In rear-end collisions, the fuel tank could rupture and ignite. Ford had identified the problem during development, but decided the fix wasn't cost-justified based on a controversial cost-benefit analysis. When this became public through lawsuits in the mid-70s, the backlash was severe. The Pinto became synonymous with corporate callousness. The relationship between Iacocca and Henry Ford II deteriorated through the 70s. Their management styles clashed. Iacocca wanted more autonomy. Henry II wanted control. In July 1978, Henry Ford II fired Iacocca. The official reason was reorganization, but everyone knew it was personal. Iacocca's firing shocked the industry. He was popular and successful, but Henry II owned the company and could do as he pleased. Iacocca would land at Chrysler and lead its remarkable turnaround. His departure left Ford without one of its most talented executives at a difficult time. The late 70s would test Ford severely. Chapter 8. Crisis Years, 1973 to 1985. The 1970s brought unprecedented challenges to the American auto industry. The oil crisis of 1973, triggered by an Arab oil embargo, caused gasoline prices to spike and created gas station lines across America. Suddenly, fuel economy became the top priority for car buyers. The big V8-powered cars Detroit had built for decades were seen as wasteful gas guzzlers. Japanese automakers were perfectly positioned to benefit. Toyota, Honda, and Datsun had been selling small, fuel-efficient cars in America for years. The oil crisis made them suddenly look smart and practical. Japanese market share began climbing steadily. Many Americans who bought Japanese cars for fuel economy discovered they were also well-built and reliable. They became repeat customers. Ford's response was mixed. The company had some small cars like the Pinto and later the Fiesta imported from Europe. But quality problems and the Pinto's safety reputation hurt sales. Ford was slow to invest in front-wheel drive and other technologies Japanese manufacturers were using effectively. The second oil crisis in 1979 intensified these problems. Gas prices spiked again. The economy fell into recession. Chrysler teetered on bankruptcy's edge and required federal loan guarantees. Ford's profits declined sharply, though the company avoided Chrysler's near-death experience. Leadership changes added to uncertainty. Henry Ford II retired as chairman in 1980. Philip Caldwell became CEO, the first non-family member to lead Ford. Donald Peterson became president. They inherited a company in crisis, losing billions, facing intense competition, and needing fundamental transformation. The early 80s were brutal. The 1980-82 recession was the worst since the Depression. auto sales collapsed. Ford lost over $3 billion. Plants closed. Tens of thousands of workers were laid off. The company teetered but never sought government help like Chrysler. Instead, Ford embarked on fundamental change. The company studied Japanese manufacturing, particularly Toyota's production system emphasizing continuous improvement and worker involvement. Ford workers visited Japan. Japanese concepts like just-in-time inventory and quality circles were adapted. Ford also changed its relationship with the UAW union. Instead of the traditional adversarial approach, Ford sought cooperation. Workers were involved in quality improvement efforts and given authority to stop production lines if they spotted defects. This was revolutionary in American manufacturing. The focus on quality produced results. Warranty claims decreased. Customer satisfaction improved. Independent quality surveys showed Ford closing the gap with Honda and Toyota. By mid-decade, Ford vehicles were substantially more reliable than just years earlier. The slogan, "Quality is Job One," reflected genuine cultural change. But the centerpiece of Ford's transformation was still being developed. The Taurus project, which wouldn't launch until 1986, represented a completely different approach. Instead of incremental changes, Ford would create an entirely new car from scratch, studying consumer preferences and benchmarking world-class competitors. Meanwhile, Ford made strategic acquisitions. In the 80s, the company purchased stakes in Mazda, establishing a partnership that brought Japanese manufacturing expertise. These moves showed Ford thinking globally and learning from competitors rather than dismissing them. The early 80s were desperate times, but they forced necessary changes. Ford had to improve or die. The company chose to improve, and the transformation would pay off dramatically in the decade ahead. Chapter 9. The Taurus Saves Ford, 1985 to 1995. The 1980s brought Ford back from the brink through a combination of cultural transformation and bold product innovation. After years of quality problems and declining competitiveness, Ford had fundamentally changed how it designed, built, and sold cars. The result would be one of the most successful vehicles in American automotive history, the Taurus. The Taurus project began in the early 80s, during Ford's darkest hours. Rather than simply refresh existing models, Ford committed to creating an entirely new car that would leapfrog competitors. The development process was revolutionary. Instead of the departments working in isolation, teams of engineers, designers, suppliers, and assembly workers collaborated from the beginning. Ford studied over 50 cars from around the world, identifying best practices. The company asked Team Taurus to create a world-class car that would restore Ford's reputation. Nothing was off-limits for questioning or improvement. The resulting design was revolutionary for American cars. The Taurus had smooth aerodynamic styling without sharp edges. Some critics called it jelly bean-shaped, but customers loved it. The interior was ergonomic and comfortable with clear instrumentation. Quality was evident throughout. The car drove well, handled confidently, and was remarkably quiet. The Taurus was launched in December 1985 with massive marketing support. Ford spent over $200 million advertising the car, emphasizing quality, design, and innovation. The company confidently offered customers the chance to compare the Taurus with any competitor. The gamble paid off spectacularly. First-year sales exceeded 200,000 units. The car won numerous awards, including Motor Trend Car of the Year. It became the best-selling car in America by 1992, dethroning the Honda Accord. The Taurus proved American automakers could build world-class cars. The Taurus's success was crucial to Ford's recovery. After losing billions in the early 80s, Ford returned to profitability in 1983 and posted record profits in the late 80s. In 1987, Ford earned more profit than General Motors for the first time since the 20s, a shocking reversal. The company's transformation went beyond one model. Ford had changed its culture, embracing quality and continuous improvement. Employee morale improved, market share increased. The company was competitive again. Ford also made strategic acquisitions. In 1989, Ford purchased Jaguar for $2.5 billion. The British luxury brand had prestige, but suffered quality problems. Ford believed it could leverage Jaguar's brand while improving operations. The company also acquired Aston Martin and took a stake in Mazda. These acquisitions reflected Ford's ambition to be a global company with brands serving different segments. Ford would be mainstream, Mercury slightly upscale, Lincoln luxury, and Jaguar and Aston Martin ultra-luxury prestige brands. The late 80s also saw Ford invest heavily in technology. Computer-aided design became standard. The company built world-class testing facilities. Electronic engine management, anti-lock brakes, and other advanced technologies improved performance and safety. Perhaps most importantly, Ford's culture had permanently changed. The company had learned that quality couldn't be inspected in after-manufacturing. It had to be built in through good design and processes. The company listened to customers and studied competitors without feeling threatened. Innovation meant processes and organization, not just technology. By 1990, Ford was transformed from quality laggard to quality leader among American automakers. The company had proven it could compete with the best from Japan and Europe. The Taurus and the quality focus behind it had literally saved Ford. Chapter 10. The SUV Empire, 1990 to 2001. The 1990s were boom years for Ford and the American auto industry. The economy was strong, gas was cheap, and consumers were buying vehicles enthusiastically. But the vehicles they wanted had changed dramatically. Passenger cars were losing ground to sport utility vehicles and pickup trucks. The SUV boom was one of the most significant market shifts in automotive history. These vehicles, originally designed for off-road use, suddenly became the vehicle of choice for suburban families. SUVs offered commanding driving position, perceived safety, generous cargo space, and rugged image. For many buyers, they represented freedom and adventure, even if they rarely left paved roads. Ford was perfectly positioned for this trend. The company had been building sport utility vehicles and trucks for decades. The Bronco had been introduced in 1966, but the vehicle that would define Ford's 90s success was the Explorer, introduced in 1990. The Explorer was based on the Ranger pickup platform but designed specifically for families. It had 4 doors, comfortable seating for 5 or 6, reasonable fuel economy for an SUV, and modern amenities. It was priced affordably, starting around $20,000. It was exactly what suburban families wanted. The Explorer became a phenomenon. Sales exceeded 400,000 units annually by the mid-90s, making it the best-selling SUV in America. Ford couldn't build them fast enough. The profits were substantial since SUVs commanded higher prices and margins than cars. Ford's truck business was equally successful. The F-Series pickup had been America's best-selling truck since 1977. In 1990s, it became America's best-selling vehicle, period, surpassing all cars. The F-150 and its heavy-duty siblings generated enormous profits for Ford. Trucks and SUVs were highly profitable, and Ford dominated these segments. This success transformed Ford's business. By the late 90s, trucks and SUVs accounted for the majority of Ford's sales and nearly all its profits. The company was becoming a truck and SUV manufacturer that also happened to sell cars. This was hugely profitable, but would create vulnerabilities when market conditions changed. Ford also continued its global expansion. The company established stronger presence in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The acquisition of Volvo in 1999 for $6.4 billion added another premium brand to Ford's portfolio. Jacques Nasser, who became CEO in 1999, pursued aggressive expansion and diversification. He believed Ford should be more than just a vehicle manufacturer. The company bought dealerships, repair shops, and even junk yards, trying to capture more of the automotive value chain. Ford also invested in internet ventures during the dot-com boom. But problems were brewing beneath the success. Quality, which had improved so dramatically in the 80s, began slipping in the 90s. Ford was introducing too many new models too quickly, overwhelming its quality systems. The company's focus on quarterly profits sometimes came at the expense of long-term investment in products and manufacturing. The most serious problem emerged in 2000 with the Ford Explorer and Firestone tire crisis. Firestone tires on Explorers were failing, causing deadly rollovers. Over 200 deaths were linked to the problem. Ford and Firestone blamed each other. The resulting recalls, lawsuits, and bad publicity damaged both companies severely. The crisis revealed deeper issues. The Explorer had design characteristics that made it more prone to rollovers than competitors. Ford had prioritized profit margins and style over stability. When combined with defective tires, the results were tragic. The Firestone crisis destroyed Ford's relationship with a supplier it had worked with for nearly a century. More importantly, it damaged Ford's reputation and revealed that quality problems hadn't been solved, just temporarily masked by better processes. As the decade ended, Ford faced new challenges. The economy was weakening, the dot-com bubble was bursting, competition was intensifying, and the SUV boom that had been so profitable was about to face serious challenges. The new century would test whether Ford's 90s success was sustainable, or just a lucky combination of strong economy and market trends. Chapter 11, Difficult Times, 2001 to 2006. The early 2000s were challenging years for Ford Motor Company. The combination of economic weakness, intensifying competition, quality problems, and strategic missteps created a perfect storm. Jacques Nasser's aggressive expansion strategy was producing losses rather than profits. The company had overpaid for acquisitions and was struggling to integrate them. Bill Ford Jr., great-grandson of Henry Ford, replaced Nasser as CEO in 2001, inheriting enormous problems. The company was losing billions annually. Market share declined steadily. Quality rankings showed Ford falling behind. The acquisitions weren't generating expected returns. Ford sold billions in assets just to raise cash. Despite these difficulties, the F-Series trucks remained profitable and popular, essentially subsidizing the rest of the struggling business. Chapter 12, Avoiding Bankruptcy, 2006 to 2010. By 2006, Ford faced a crisis rivaling the 1940s. The company was hemorrhaging billions annually. Alan Mulally, brought in from Boeing, became CEO with a mandate to save Ford. His plan, called One Ford, focused the company on the Ford brand globally, mortgaged virtually all company assets, including the blue oval logo, to secure $23 billion in credit, and accelerated restructuring. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, GM and Chrysler required government bailouts. Ford did not, drawing on Mullally's borrowed funds. This decision gave Ford credibility as the domestic automaker that survived on its own. Painful restructuring closed plants, cut workers, and discontinued Mercury, and sold Jaguar, Land Rover, Aston Martin, and Volvo. Ford simplified to focus on core business. Chapter 13. One Ford Vision, 2010 to 2014. Mullally's One Ford strategy delivered results. The company returned to profitability in 2009 and maintained it through 2014. Ford developed global platforms, building the same vehicles worldwide with regional variations, reducing costs dramatically. The Fusion, Focus, and Escape became competitive globally. Quality improved significantly, earning Ford top rankings. The company invested heavily in fuel efficiency through EcoBoost turbocharged engines, delivering V8 power with V6 fuel economy. The controversial decision to put EcoBoost in the F-15 proved successful, maintaining performance while improving efficiency. Ford's recovery was complete by 2014, with Mullally retiring as a corporate savior. Chapter 14. Trucks and Technology, 2014 to 2020. Mark Fields succeeded Mullally, but lasted only 3 years before being replaced by Jim Hackett in 2017. The company faced new challenges: software, autonomy, connectivity. Ford invested billions in autonomous vehicle technology, artificial intelligence, and mobility services. The shift from internal combustion to electric power was beginning. Ford announced plans to electrify its lineup while continuing to dominate trucks. The F-Series remained America's best-selling vehicle for decades. Ford introduced the aluminum-bodied F-150 in 2015, controversially reducing weight while maintaining capability. By 2020, trucks and SUVs accounted for 90% of Ford's North American sales, generating virtually all profits. Chapter 15. The Electric Future, 2020 to present. Jim Farley became CEO in October 2020, inheriting a company in the midst of massive transformation. The COVID pandemic disrupted everything, but Ford adapted quickly. The major focus became electrification. Ford announced the F-150 Lightning, an electric version of America's best-selling vehicle. The Lightning, starting at $40,000, brought electric trucks to mainstream buyers. The Mustang Mach-E, an electric SUV, became a surprise hit. Ford committed $50 billion to electrification through 2026. The company reorganized into Ford Blue for gas vehicles, Ford Model A for electric, and Ford Pro for commercial. This structure acknowledged the different economics and strategies needed. Farley emphasized that Ford would lead the electric truck revolution, leveraging its truck expertise. Epilogue, Legacy and Tomorrow. From Henry Ford's first quadricycle in 1896 to today's electric F-150 Lightning, Ford Motor Company's story spans over a century of American industrial history. The company revolutionized manufacturing with the assembly line, democratized transportation with the Model T, and survived near-death experiences through adaptation and resilience. Ford put America on wheels, helped win 2 world wars, and employed millions. Today, Ford faces its biggest transformation since the Model T, the shift to electric vehicles. With over 170,000 employees and operations worldwide, Ford is betting its future on electrification, especially electric trucks. where it hopes to maintain dominance. The challenges are immense. New competitors like Tesla, massive capital requirements, and uncertainty about consumer adoption. But Ford has survived and thrived through greater challenges. The blue oval endures, representing American ingenuity, perseverance, and the belief that mobility creates opportunity. The next chapter of Ford's story is being written now, in electric vehicles, autonomous technology, and connected services. Whatever the future brings, Ford Motor Company's impact on America and the world is indelible and permanent. Chapter 15. The Electric Future, 2020 to Present. Jim Farley became CEO in October 2020, inheriting a company in the midst of massive transformation. The COVID pandemic disrupted everything, but Ford adapted quickly. The major focus became electrification. Ford announced the F-150 Lightning, an electric version of America's best-selling vehicle. The Lightning, starting at $40,000, brought electric trucks to mainstream buyers. The Mustang Mach-E, an electric SUV, became a surprise hit. Ford committed $50 billion to electrification through 2026. The company reorganized into Ford Blue for gas vehicles, Ford Model E for electric, and Ford Pro for commercial. This structure acknowledged the different economics and strategies needed. Farley emphasized that Ford would lead the electric truck revolution, leveraging its truck expertise.